Hello and welcome. In a world full of noise, emotion, and propaganda on all sides, very few people take the time to calmly explain what is really going on in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Today, we're going to slow things down and look closely at three key elements: the actual situation on the battlefield, the state of Ukraine's armed forces, and the quiet but important negotiations being discussed between Moscow and Washington. This is not about taking a slogan or cheering for one side, but about understanding the strategic reality that is now shaping the future of Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the United States. Let's dive into the analysis. In a recent press conference in Bishkek, Vladimir Putin presented a confident and uncompromising view of the war in Ukraine and of the associated diplomatic process. He claimed that Russian forces are advancing ever faster on the battlefield, while Ukraine's army is suffering unsustainable losses and failing to replace its manpower. According to the figures he cited, Ukraine allegedly lost around 47,000 soldiers in October, while being able to mobilize only about 16,000 new recruits and return some 15,000 previously wounded soldiers to the front, leaving a monthly deficit that Putin says is growing over time. Independent analysts, such as Gordon Hahn, whom the commentator cites, similarly argue that Ukraine's manpower pool is shrinking, not only in quantity, but in quality, with many new recruits being older, less healthy, poorly trained, and demotivated. On this basis, the Ukrainian army is portrayed as a force that is rapidly degrading, with some units reduced to ghost brigades that exist more on paper than in reality. The suggestion is that Ukrainian commanders and perhaps political leaders in Kyiv may be making operational decisions based on inflated official personnel figures rather than the much smaller number of soldiers actually present in units. There is also speculation that corrupt officers might be over-reporting troop numbers in order to divert the salaries of non-existent soldiers. All of this, in the narrator's view, helps explain Russia's increasing momentum at the front and Putin's confident tone. The analysis then turns to diplomacy and to what is described as the clearest explanation yet from Putin of the so-called Anchorage understanding with Donald Trump. According to this narrative, the meeting in Alaska did not produce a concrete peace agreement, but rather a list of up to 28 points for discussion proposed by the United States as an agenda for future negotiations. One controversial element reportedly included was an American idea that Ukraine would withdraw from Donbass in exchange for a ceasefire in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The commentator now argues that Putin never accepted such a ceasefire as a binding deal. Instead, he merely agreed to consider it as one item on a broader negotiating agenda, something that later Western reporting allegedly misunderstood or misrepresented. From Putin's more recent remarks, the Russian position is described as even more rigid than before. He is quoted as saying that hostilities will only cease when Ukrainian troops fully withdraw from all territories that Russia claims as its own: Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. If Ukrainian forces do not leave these areas voluntarily, he insists that Russia will force the issue militarily. This restates and reinforces the line he set out in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June 2024. A ceasefire can only come after Ukraine abandons its claim to those territories in practice. The commentator emphasizes that this position appears to be poorly understood, or at least publicly underplayed, in much of the Western media. A substantial part of the analysis deals with the mechanics of negotiations themselves. Putin is presented as insisting on a formal, structured diplomatic process between Russia and the United States, led on his side by the Russian Foreign Ministry and supported by senior presidential aides such as Vladimir Medinsky and Yuri Ushakov. The commentator contrasts this vision: regular plenary sessions, teams of experienced diplomats and military experts, clear agendas, and systematic treatment of each point, with what he characterizes as the more ad hoc improvisational style of American engagement over the past year, involving special envoys turning up with proposals for grain deals or temporary ceasefires. In his view, Moscow wants a classical state-to-state negotiation, while Washington has struggled to commit to such a framework. This theme carries over into the discussion of the Abu Dhabi meeting, where Russian and Ukrainian intelligence officials reportedly met ostensibly about prisoner exchanges, but in the commentator's view, more likely to address the covert, dirty war of sabotage and assassinations that both sides accuse each other of conducting. The presence of a senior FSB official rather than a military intelligence representative is taken as a sign that Russia views this as a counterterrorism and counterintelligence problem, not merely a military one. The fact that a U.S. Representative Driscoll joined the meeting unexpectedly and then tried to use it as a springboard to bring forward a planned Moscow visit by the American delegation is presented as evidence of disorganization and mixed signals in Washington. Putin reportedly agreed, cut short his trip to Bishkek to be ready to meet the U.S. delegation, only to be told that the Americans would come the following week. After all, the commentator also explores another major Russian condition, legal recognition of territorial changes. In the reported exchange with a journalist, Putin is said to insist that some form of formal recognition, at least from the United States, of Russia's sovereignty over Crimea and the 4 annexed regions is a key point in any settlement. The idea of recognizing these areas de facto but not de jure, which has appeared in some Western proposals, is criticized as inherently ambiguous and dangerous. From the Russian perspective presented here, any gray area over the legal status of these territories could be used to justify renewed Ukrainian military action in the future as an attempt to restore order on what Kyiv calls its own land. Hence, Moscow wants clear, unambiguous recognition to avoid future escalation. This helps explain, in the narrator's view, why there is such intense resistance in Kyiv and in European capitals. Western officials like NATO's Secretary General are quoted reaffirming that Russia has no say over NATO expansion and that Ukraine's future membership remains on the table, positions that directly clash with Russia's stated red lines. Ukrainian leaders such as Zelensky and his chief of staff Yermak are portrayed as publicly ruling out any territorial concessions and refusing even to discuss such options. Meanwhile, European leaders like Macron and Starmer are depicted as still talking about the possible deployment of European troops to Ukraine and demanding terms that make a compromise settlement very difficult. Another element that worries Ukraine's leadership, according to this analysis, is the Russian insistence on Ukrainian elections. Putin is said to argue that Zelensky's term expired in May 2024, that the current authorities therefore lack constitutional legitimacy, and that only a newly elected president and parliament would have the legal authority to sign and ratify a peace treaty. The commentator notes that Putin openly suggests that the current team in Kyiv would almost certainly lose any genuinely competitive election and could only remain in power by rigging the vote. In effect, this is interpreted as a Russian call for regime change in Kyiv through elections, a prospect that understandably alarms Ukraine's ruling circle and their European backers. The geopolitical implication, as drawn out in the commentary, is that Russia and the United States are moving toward a model similar to past conflicts, direct great power negotiations over the heads of a smaller ally. Historical analogies are invoked with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the talks with the Taliban over Afghanistan, where Washington ultimately dealt directly with the main adversary while local partners had limited influence over the terms. If such a pattern were to emerge again, Ukraine and the European Union would lose the de facto veto they have enjoyed so far over any settlement. That, in turn, would intensify their incentive to resist or delay USS Russian talks. All of this is set against the backdrop of an accelerating Russian offensive on the ground, as described in great detail. The capture of multiple villages in Donbass and Zaporizhia within 24 hours. The tightening of Russian positions around key towns, such as Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and the progressive encirclement of Ukrainian forces in various cauldrons. Russian sources are quoted claiming control over thousands of buildings in contested urban areas and depicting Ukrainian troops in exposed positions east of key towns as demoralized and exhausted. While exact figures and battlefield claims are difficult to verify independently, the overall picture painted is one of steady Russian gains and a Ukrainian defense under intense pressure. The concluding argument of the analysis is that time is working against Ukraine and, by extension, against any diplomatic process that requires months of structured negotiations. The commentator suggests that the months wasted since the Anchorage summit may prove decisive. Russia's military position has improved markedly. Ukraine's army is said to be nearing a breaking point, and yet the political and diplomatic machinery in Washington, Kyiv, and European capitals appears fragmented, divided, and slow to adapt. Even if all sides suddenly agreed to begin formal talks tomorrow, he raises the question of whether there would be enough time to negotiate, draft, and ratify a comprehensive settlement before events on the battlefield render many of these proposals moot. Moreover, the commentator warns that we may be approaching a decisive shift not only in the military balance but in global diplomacy itself. If Russia succeeds in shaping the battlefield to its advantage before a coherent Western negotiating position emerges, Moscow will be in a position to dictate rather than debate terms. The formula that many Western leaders hope to preserve, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, may simply collapse if Ukraine's remaining bargaining chips continue to disappear, one village, one supply line, and one depleted brigade at a time. A second strategic dimension, rarely acknowledged publicly in Western media, concerns the psychological impact of Ukraine's manpower crisis. Wars are not merely contests of equipment and logistics. They are competitions of national will. If, as the analysis suggests, morale among Ukrainian frontline units is being eroded by impossible rotations, chronic shortages, and growing distrust of leadership in Kyiv, then Russia gains a multiplier effect. Each localized defeat weakens not only the Ukrainian army's physical structure, but its belief in the attainability of victory. Once that belief falters, the collapse of defensive lines can accelerate rapidly. The history offers many examples of forces that seemed stable until a sudden cascade of withdrawals revealed a tipping point had been passed. Likewise, the discussion implies a strategic misalignment between European capitals and Washington. For all the rhetoric of unity, Europe's political class is split between those who hope still to pressure Russia militarily and those who privately acknowledge the need for a negotiated retreat from maximalist objectives. Moscow, keenly aware of these fractures, appears willing to exacerbate them by advancing militarily while demanding political concessions that Europeans cannot publicly accept. By forcing Western governments to confront the contradiction between their stated goals and their diminishing leverage, Russia, effective. At the same time, the analysis hints at a broader geopolitical wager. Russia believes that the United States, regardless of who occupies the White House, will eventually prioritize strategic stability with Moscow over indefinite support to Kyiv. The Anchorage framework, even in its tentative form, is depicted as evidence that Washington recognizes the necessity of direct superpower dialogue. If this trajectory continues, Ukraine's agency in determining its own fate may shrink dramatically. History shows that when great powers negotiate outcomes, the interests of smaller allies are often treated as variables rather than constants. Finally, the commentary suggests a looming diplomatic paradox. The longer the West delays in engaging Russia seriously, the more maximalist Moscow's demands may become. What was once a debate over Donbass has expanded to include 4 additional regions. What was once framed as a temporary ceasefire now requires total Ukrainian withdrawal. What was once about ending hostilities now demands constitutional change in Kyiv. Time, in other words, is not a neutral factor. It is actively reshaping the conditions of any future settlement. Taken together, these arguments portray a moment of profound strategic inflection. Ukraine's resilience, Western cohesion, and the ability of international diplomacy to respond quickly enough are all being tested simultaneously. If any one of these pillars fails decisively, the war may enter a new phase, not of high-intensity battle across shifting front lines, but of political consolidation by Moscow and difficult reckonings across Europe and the United States. The question implicitly raised is not whether the conflict will end, but whether policymakers in the West still have the capacity to influence the terms on which it does. We'll stop here for today. The situation on the front lines, the state of the Ukrainian army, and the diplomatic maneuvers between Moscow, Washington, and Europe are all moving quickly and often in different directions. Understanding this conflict requires more than emotion. It requires patience, context, and a willingness to question easy narratives. I hope this breakdown has helped you see the bigger picture behind the daily headlines. Thank you for watching, and take care.